I want to talk about a tweet that was put out by my friend and colleague, Dr. Monica Gandhi. Monica Gandhi is an infectious disease physician here at UCSF. Her office is just down the hall from mine. She is the director of the HIV/AIDS Center at San Francisco General Hospital. She is an expert in ID and has been in ID for a fair number of years and has a tremendous reputation in the field. She has been a commenter during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, and she's somebody I appreciate. I agree with her a lot more than the average person, but there are a few things I substantively disagree with her on. But I really appreciate having somebody like Monica. She's somebody who's able to persuade the people who are in this field, in the infectious disease field, and she's somebody who's been a really important voice. She has a tweet out now with her 8 suggestions for 2022, and I want to run through them. I'm going to put her tweet right up here. These are the 8 suggestions for 2022. It's 2 tweets, so I don't know if I'll fit it right on the screen. But I'm going to run through them, and I'm going to talk about my thoughts to it, because I think it's an important thread, even though it's 2 tweets. It's important 2 tweets that Monica has put out. So here they are. My 8 suggested changes for COVID policy 2022. Number 1, boosters. Risk stratify. Do young males need spaced doses? That's her first point. Monica is spot on. We need somebody like this, like Monica, to say this, but this is a really important point. Boosters certainly have a role to play for older people, for immunocompromised people, but do they have a role to play for everybody over the age of 18? I've been asking myself that in a number of videos. I've been asking myself that in some written pieces I've done, because the risk of boosters, particularly myocarditis, we don't yet know exactly what the risk is, but there's got to be some ballpark sense of risk that we know to date. It's going to be highest in men under the age of 40. It's probably going to be highest from Moderna over Pfizer. And you have to balance that risk with the benefit. What is the benefit to a 16, 17, 18-year-old man from getting a booster? Now, if that benefit is a transient reduction in the risk of getting a symptomatic COVID-19 infection, that's not as strong a benefit as a durable benefit in reduced risk of hospitalization or death. That's a better benefit. And I think we really need to see that better benefit to offset the risk of myocarditis, which leads to a hospital stay, on average in the UK paper, 3 days in the hospital. So we need to see that benefit in terms of reduction in SARS-CoV-2, hospitalization, severe disease, mortality. We don't yet know. And it's certainly going to be different as somebody's younger. The risk-benefit balance may tip. So Monica's right. She has her finger on the pulse. Do young men need this at all? Can we omit it? Can we space the doses further apart for young men to mitigate the risk? Can we switch to Pfizer instead of Moderna, as European nations are doing? These are important questions to ask, and Monica's right to ask them. Number 2 on Monica's list, mask mandates based on hospitalization rates like Marin. Monica here is saying that our mandates need to be tied to some measure of harm of the virus, not simply cases, but she prefers hospitalization. She's written a New York Times op-ed. Now, I would approach this slightly different. What I had always wanted to see was many more cluster randomized control trials to know if this intervention, this mandate actually works, and if so, under what circumstances. I've talked about on this channel before the Bangladesh cluster RCT. I don't think it informs the United States in this moment. It was run in rural Bangladesh. Nobody had natural immunity. Nobody had vaccination. Compliance was, mediocre. Cloth masks failed on the primary endpoint of symptom-driven seroprevalence. And surgical masks were a winner with an 11% relative risk reduction. There are now some questions being raised about the precise number of events in that trial. Putting all that aside, our mask mandates in this country are predominantly cloth mask mandates. I'm not sure they are justified by Bangladesh RCT. But Monica, she takes a middle ground position. I would prefer randomized trials, cluster randomized trials to prove this works. And if not, I think we have to do away with these mandates. Monica says, let's at least compromise. Let's benchmark it to hospitalization. And, the other option is, if you don't accept Monica's compromise, the other option might be that people aren't going to do away with it and there won't be any clear stopping rules. And I think that's very problematic. So, maybe we can agree on the middle ground position that Monica has put forward. Number 3, CDC endorses test to stay in schools. And I think here what Monica's talking about is that we have, throughout this pandemic, had very draconian policies that if one kid tests positive for SARS-CoV-2, any kid in that class has to be quarantined for some prolonged period of time, like 14 days, which is a huge disruption to their school. But in some places, like Montgomery County, Maryland, they go further. So if one kid has a symptom that is consistent with a SARS-CoV-2 symptom, the whole class has to quarantine for some period of time. This is incredibly disruptive to education. The damage of missing school has already been done from 1 year of depriving children of school. If you continue to keep pulling them out of school for all these positive test results, or worse, even a symptom, you are severely going to hamper their education. So Monica says, let's take a middle ground position. Let's test to stay. I think many of us can accept that middle ground position. It's not reasonable. The other option is just to exclude everyone for a prolonged period of time. That's terrible. Now, I might prefer, even more on the other extreme. I mean, I think we can do a cluster randomized control trial of different strategies. 1, test to stay. 2, just go back to class. I think that's one possibility. If you're asymptomatic, just go back to class. And a cluster randomized trial could have some safety protection to see if that's actually deleterious or not, especially these young ages. Monica prefers the test to stay option. I'd rather take that over pushing kids out of school for 14 days. So I think, she's offering a sensible middle ground. Again, I think cluster randomization is the answer here. Number 4, masks optional. 8 to 12 weeks after the availability of child vaccines. This is Monica's 4th point. She wants to see that masks are optional in schools after this. Now, I have been somebody who said we did a disservice to children by not generating credible data. We should have done cluster randomized trial of masking in schools if we were going to do it for so long. I was happy to bite my tongue for 1 year about the lack of evidence of this strategy in schools, but once you get into year 2 or year 3 or in perpetuity, I think somebody has to speak up and say your evidence base was quite lacking. Now, Monica, again, this is a compromised position. Monica's saying, let's put aside what we think about this issue. Let's just say once we make the vaccines available to 5 to 11, 8 to 12 weeks after they've been available, we're going to do away with mask mandates in school. I think many of us would prefer that over the status quo, which is probably indefinite masking in some liberal cities, liberal enclaves on the coast. This is a better solution. So again, Monica splitting the difference. The wisdom of somebody who has navigated, I think, the politics and science and the academy of infectious disease. Number 5, Paxlovid ASAP. And I believe this is the Pfizer drug. I'm not going to comment too much because I have not yet read all the data. I'm going to do that. I like to do that kind of stuff, but I haven't gotten into it yet. So that's Monica's point. Number 6, acknowledge natural immunity like Europe. Yeah, isn't she right? Yes, in Europe, in many places, where they do institute passports to enter restaurants or bars, there's always a clause that says, or if you didn't get the vaccine, or if you've had a documented infection and recovered from that within the last 6 months, year, something like that in different European nations. We just need to acknowledge it so we can build it into that. We need to acknowledge it so that if somebody had natural infection, maybe we will give them credit for just 1 dose of vaccine. I mean, putting aside how you feel about mandates, and I've written many papers on this, many op-eds on this, been critical of mandates in general. I think that they will have some untoward political consequences and actually have some unintended consequences we don't fully envision. Monica, again, splitting the difference. At least let's acknowledge natural immunity. At least let's build that into our role and rule book. Fair compromise. The other extreme is that there's no acknowledgement of it at all, and then people push for policies like the LA policy. It doesn't matter if a 12-year-old boy has had and recovered from COVID. If that boy didn't get 2 doses in a certain period of time, they were going to throw them out of school. Thank goodness this week they put out moratorium on that for the time being, but they might be back to it. LA Times has an editorial that I think is really off the mark, but it's encouraging them to come back to that. Number 7, CDC reporting better data on severe breakthroughs so we can advise on boosters, masking, etc. Yeah, I don't think there's anyone who disagrees. We need the CDC to report better data. It should be in real time. It shouldn't be in any lag. They shouldn't withhold or suppress data. We need to get all the data out there. We cannot merely have the people who work within the CDC thinking about this issue. We have lots of people interested. Make the data widely available. I've always been pro data sharing. You can go back. You can read my quotes from 2014, I think in the Boston Globe, 2015, when people in the New England Journal were calling data sharing, pushes for data sharing, data parasitism. I was out there defending data sharing. I think now more than ever, we need massive data sharing, particularly for this kind of population data. Number 8. Monica's 8th point, stop travel bans, harm reduction approach, global equity, acknowledge that this is endemic, and prevent illness. Can't argue with that. 100% agree. Travel bans, pointless. Closing the barn door when the horse has already fled. Harm reduction approach, meaning that we're never going to be without this virus. It is endemic. Accept that. But what it means is we need to mitigate the harm of the virus while preserving regular life, going back to work, going back to school. Global equity. Yeah. Does it make sense to be boosting a 12-year-old in a rich nation when an 85-year-old in sub-Saharan Africa, India, China may not have even had an opportunity to get the vaccine? Brazil, perhaps. That's not fair. It's not just. How many vaccines do rich nations get before they start vaccinating older, vulnerable people globally? I think it's a tragedy. It's a deep ethical crime. They'll look back on this 1,000 years from now, and they'll view us as barbaric that we even allowed such a thing to happen. Prevent illness, illness. By illness, I think Monica means being really sick with this disease, which is the goal of this whole thing. And then, she had some caveats in response to some of the feedback she got. But what I will say this is, Monica is somebody who has taken heat, I think, by all sides. She's taken heat by the incredibly risk-averse zero COVID ID epidemiology crowd, which is a crowd she hangs in with because she, is from that group. She's also, by her own statements in public record, left-leaning, left of left, extremely left of center kind of person, but she's up against, I think, a lot of people on that side who she disagrees with fundamentally. She's much more balanced harm reduction approach. Is she someone who is maximally skeptical? Is she someone who wants maximal randomized control trials? No, I don't think so. I'm much more skeptical. I'm much more proponent of cluster randomized trials. If you're going to institute policies on people, I'm much more similar to Zeb Yamrozik. I'm much more to her side a little bit in the need to generate data. If you want to have credibility in the public's eye, I'm much more reluctant to embrace, some of these things. And that's, I think, the slight part where I disagree with her. But we need Monica Gandhi. I mean, I think people underappreciate her role in this pandemic. She's been a tremendous and important voice. People love her. People have criticized her, but people love her. And she's necessary to strike some middle ground. Sometimes you have to make compromises. The thing about a compromise is nobody is exactly quite happy, but we need compromises because I'm a little bit more worried we'll drift into that alternative scenario where there'll be no off-ramp to masking kids, that there'll be no consideration of natural immunity, that we will push boosters on 16-year-old boys irrespective of their unique benefit and harm profile because we want a one-size-fits-all solution. I'm worried about that. So I'll take Monica Gandhi's compromise over what I'm watching every day. So I wanted to talk about this tweet. I think it's important. Monica is somebody who I deeply respect. I am offended every time I see anyone criticize her, attack her in very harsh and personal terms on the internet. I think that's wrong. I think she's an important voice, and I think even for those of us who largely agree with her but occasionally disagree, we need her out there. And I think when the history books are written, she will be viewed as a real hero of the pandemic. So those are my thoughts on this tweet. I saw it today, and I just felt like I had to comment and give my voice of support. Of course, I am biased. My office is right down the hall, so I sometimes knock on her door to get some sage advice and to talk about what's going on in this world. On that positive note, if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below, hit that bell. Until next time.